This remains the closest I've ever been to danger in my life. It was around a decade ago, and I had only been driving for a couple of years, and mostly on local roads. I was in my early 20s and had been talking to a girl online for a few months. We had never met in person, so I decided to offer to drive to where she lived so that we could see each other face to face. She agreed, so we set a date. The Saturday that we had agreed on came around quickly, and I had my route all planned out. The drive was pretty long for me, around 2.5 hours, but I was keen to finally meet her. I had a few problems with the roads, as she lived in an area totally new to me, and she lived in a larger town than I was used to. The day went great, but it's not really part of how scary my day turned out, so I'll skip to my journey home. By now, it was around 10 at night, and I'd noticed that my phone had terrible reception all day. Because of this, I figured that I would try to remember how I got there and do my journey home in reverse. This didn't turn out to be my wisest move. It was clear to me that once I left the town, I was on a road I had not traveled down on my way there. After a few miles of this dark and oddly country road, considering how close to town it was, I noticed a small garage and felt like the best thing to do was to pull in and try to find out exactly which direction I was heading before I got any more lost. I pulled in and parked up and brought up my sat-nav on my phone, hoping for a signal. Luckily enough, it was working fine, and I planned my route for home from that point. Before I pulled away, however, I noticed a toilet sign on a door at the rear of the garage. Now, I'm not saying that the garage looked dirty exactly, but it did look a little old and run down. Maybe not my first choice of places to use the bathroom, but I had over 2 hours of driving ahead of me and felt the urge to go. It wasn't the type of thing easily done in the bushes either, if you get my meaning. So, reluctantly, I got out of my car and headed for the door. There were no signs saying I needed a key from the main garage, and as I pushed on the door, it opened. The men's door was straight ahead of me, so I headed in. It wasn't the nicest place I'd seen, but not too bad, so I picked my cubicle and locked the door. I hoped no one else would come in. I think that's normal for us all. After a little while of listening to the background hum of, I'm guessing, some sort of generator, I heard the main door squeak open. Then 3 or 4 footsteps, then silence. Whoever had just come in seemed to be just standing silently. I heard no ruffles of clothing, no zipper. Then, I heard metallic clanking, like someone looking through a bag of tools, which I'm sure that's what it was because of what followed. As I sat there in silence, waiting to hear what was going to happen next, there followed 5 massively loud metallic bangs. I jumped to my feet, shouted, "What the fuck?" And like lightning, I sorted myself out. As I stood there watching the cubicle door, I heard footsteps coming towards me. By now, I'm pretty scared at what's going on, and then I hear my door being pushed. It was locked, but whoever was on the other side of it tried 3 more times to open it. I was now terrified. Not only was someone trying to open my door, they had tools out there with them. Then the footsteps retreated, and I could hear the rummaging of tools again. Then the steps returned to my door, and I heard and felt 2 large blows on the door. Thankfully, the door held out. I was at a loss at what to do. I didn't even have my phone. I had left it on charge in my car. Then I heard him walk away, collect his tools, and leave. I waited a few seconds, then unlocked the door and peeked out. All I could see was a screwdriver stuck in the lock of the condom machine. All of that for some change? I'm guessing that's what he was after. I ran out of there. Hand washing wasn't even a consideration. I looked all around me once outside and could see no one, so I ran for my car, locked the doors, and tried to get out of there as quickly as possible. As I sped to the junction, though, from nowhere a hammer came flying through the air and bounced off the bonnet of my car. I couldn't see who had thrown it. He must have been standing in the darkness, but I knew who it was. I almost left that garage on 2 wheels. I was so scared. Why I had become this man's enemy, I had no idea. Did I spoil his heist? I mean, let's face it, he was never going to get rich from that machine. I'm always warning people to be careful when they're out on their own, especially in unfamiliar places, but I guess we don't always take our own advice. I've always been an impulsive person, and when I saw an advert for a motorbike that I had been saving for, I knew I had to have it. The problem was, it was a long way from where I lived. This might have stopped some people from considering it, but not me. I had enough savings, and a little thing like distance wasn't going to stop me. After communicating with the owner and asking all of the questions I needed answers to, we agreed on a date to pick up my new toy. I went through a few different ideas on how best to do this, but as the bike was out of MOT, I decided to borrow a friend of mine's bike trailer and drive down myself. Doing some research on routes, it would apparently take me around 4.5 hours. I was traveling from the east coast of Scotland to the north of Wales. The time and distance did bother me slightly, but I was so keen to get my hands on that motorbike and pig-headed enough to ignore the round-trip figures. My budget did not allow for fanciful ideas of hotels, so it was a definite there and back all at once kind of thing. I hooked up the trailer to my car around 12 p.m. and set straight off. The seller preferred that I get there around 5 p.m. Although it would have been much better for me if I could have set off a lot earlier, I didn't make an issue of it. The thought of driving back in darkness towing a motorbike and trailer did worry me though. The journey there took me much longer than I had estimated, more like 6 hours, and it was already beginning to get dark when I arrived. I was pleased that the seller had a garage that was well lit, so I could inspect the bike properly. I was very happy with my purchase, but it took around 90 minutes to inspect it, securely strap it to the trailer, and have a chat with the seller, who turned out to be a really nice man. I finally set off at 7:30, and by that time, it was almost fully dark, as it was winter. My plan was to periodically pull over and inspect the straps attaching the motorbike to the trailer to make sure they stayed secure. About an hour into my homeward journey, I saw a small sign for a parking lay-by, so I thought it would be a perfect time to do my checks. I also pretty badly needed to go to the toilet, so I could kill 2 birds with 1 stone, as they say. It turned out to be one of those dirt tracks that came away from the road and then joined back after 100 yards or so, with a thin line of trees between the lay-by and the main road. There were no lights whatsoever and no amenities, but it was so dark and obscured from the road, at least I could use the trees to relieve myself. With the rear lights of my car, I could only just make out the straps, so I checked them all, and they were as tight as they were when I placed them, so I jumped back into my car. I sat for a while thinking about how long it would take me to get home. It would take me longer towing the bike, so I decided to rest for 10 minutes. I had no intention of falling asleep, not with my new toy out in the open, but somehow I did. I have never worked out how long I slept, but I think it was between 10 to 20 minutes. I do know, though, that it was movement of my car that woke me up. I was so shocked that I had fallen asleep and totally confused at what had moved my car. My instinct kicked in, and I turned the ignition immediately and pulled away. My eyes were darting everywhere, but I could see nothing. As I drove to the exit of the lay-by, I looked in my rear-view mirror, and my motorbike front tire was just visible, so I knew it was still there, but I could see nothing else. Then, as I applied the brakes before pulling out onto the main road, the extra light illuminated more of the bike. But to my horror, I could also see a large black shape. I froze with fear. There were so many thoughts running through my mind, so many that I can't now recall them. But as much as I wanted to put my foot to the floor and speed out of there, I'm pretty sure I didn't, because I could hurt, or worse, whoever it was sitting on that bike. I'm sure I was breathing at 1,000 miles per hour, and my heart was beating out of my chest. But before I could think of what to do, that black shape moved. What terrified me that night, and what gives me chills now, was the way that it moved. It went up. It didn't get off to the side like a person would, just up. and disappeared. Luckily, there were no cars coming because I pulled out onto the main road without even checking. I was so freaked out. Nothing I could think of then, and nothing I can think of now, goes up. When I eventually got home, I checked the bike properly, but could see nothing out of the ordinary. If you do find yourself in Wales and needing a rest from driving, if I were you, I would wait until you find some well-lit services. This happened in December 2017. My daughter was at university at that time, and she was starting her Christmas break. Normally she used the train, but as she had already bought gifts, and one in particular was quite large, I offered to drive down and pick her up. After loading up the car, we headed off on the 3.5-hour journey home. We had a lot to catch up on, and to be honest, my daughter is well known for being a constant talker, so I knew she would keep me entertained on what was a monotonous motorway drive. We did decide to stop at some point halfway for a bite to eat, a rest, and some needed caffeine. Around midway home, we pulled into a motorway service that I had been to on a previous occasion, and I knew it had a few options for a sit-down meal. After parking, we decided that Burger King was the best choice, and it was pretty quiet, so it was easy to get a seat. We collected our order and picked seats near a window. It was starting to get dark outside, so the large window acted as a mirror, and I could see a reflection of a portion of the restaurant. As we chatted and ate our food, I noticed a man sit down on the other side of the room with a drink, but no food. He stood out to me, as there was something intense about his face, a serious-looking man. He got out his phone and looked down at it, so I just got on with eating and chatting to my daughter. As we were finishing up and getting ready to leave, I happened to glance at the window and noticed that the man was staring intently at us. His phone was positioned out in front of him as if he was reading or watching something, but I could see that his eyes were not looking at it. They were fixed on us. My first thought was that maybe he was spaced out and wasn't aware that he was staring, so I turned around and looked directly at him. I regretted this immediately, as my expectation was that he would realize and look away, feeling embarrassed. But that didn't happen. He continued to stare, and for the first time I saw him and not his reflection. I really didn't like his intensity, and his eyes scared me. I turned away and tried to pretend it didn't happen, and I said nothing to my daughter. She seemed oblivious to the situation, and I didn't want her to look at him either. As we talked about using the bathroom and getting back to our journey home, I once again glanced at the man's reflection, hoping to see his attention elsewhere, or better still, that he had left the restaurant. Unfortunately, what I saw chilled me to my core. He was still there glaring at us, but what scared me even more was that his phone was tilted towards us, as if taking pictures or a video. My daughter could see there was something wrong. It was hard to hide how I was feeling, but I just said that I was tired. I said, "Come on, let's go," and we headed off to the bathroom. While we were in there, I explained everything to my daughter and told her we should get into the car as quickly as possible and get out of there. She hadn't even noticed the man at all, never mind his weird behavior. As we rushed out of the complex, we had to pass the windows of Burger King, and we glanced in to see him. But to my horror, he was gone. Without speaking, we instinctively rushed to the car. I looked all around and could see no one, but there were so many places for someone to hide. When we reached the car, we jumped in and I locked the doors. Not feeling safe though, I started the engine and quickly pulled away. I pulled onto the motorway and drove as fast as I dared, attempting to put as much distance as possible between us and those services. Both of us were pretty shaken, but feeling relief that the threat was over, or so we thought. For the next 15 minutes, I explained everything in more detail to my daughter. We discussed what to do about it, but there really didn't seem to be anything we could do. A weird-looking man staring at us, and what looked like filming us, or taking pictures, really didn't seem like something the police would act on, along with the fact that my daughter hadn't even seen him, so would only be my word. So we decided to do nothing, just get home. We gradually started talking about other things, mainly what we were doing over Christmas and who was visiting us over the holiday period. I normally like to keep to the speed limit, and there were plenty of cars passing us in the fast lane. Then, I noticed a car that was overtaking us had been sitting level with us for far too long. There was no traffic ahead of him, so I could see no reason for him to do this. I looked over toward the driver, and it was him, the weirdo. I swore, and my daughter looked at me questioningly. I said, "The weirdo is beside us." It was dark and hard to see, but it was definitely him. My daughter looked past me and into the car that was keeping pace with us. She said, "Should I call the police?" I said, "Yes." And as she was calling, the car dropped back and pulled in behind us. It was like he wanted us to know it was him. My daughter explained the situation, and after lots of explaining as to where we exactly were, the police advised us to come off the motorway at a junction around 3 miles from where we were, as there was a police car there already, and to pull up behind it when we saw it. As we neared the slip road to the junction, I felt certain that the man would carry on the motorway, but he didn't. He followed us off the exit. I was so relieved when I saw the police car parked on the bridge over the motorway, and I headed straight for them. The weird man must have realized where I was heading and quickly changed lanes and turned onto the road in the opposite direction to where the police car was facing. I quickly pulled up, and an officer was already out of his vehicle, so I shouted to him that the man had driven away, and I pointed in the direction. The police officer said, "Stay here and put your hazard lights on." He then jumped into his car and, lights blazing, sped towards the man. 15 or 20 minutes later, a different officer turned up and said that he had been caught and was being questioned. Our details were taken along with an outline of what had happened. We went home, and the next afternoon, the police called to say that the man denied everything and weirdly had no phone on him. The cameras at the Burger King were checked, but were recording the counter, not the seating area. They conducted a search for his phone, believing that he had thrown it from his car window, but they didn't find it. The man was released. The police officer said he had found the man to be quite odd and had mental health problems, but they couldn't do anything without proof of his intention, so they had to let him go. What fills me with fear to this day is, what exactly would he have done if the police hadn't intervened? This is a true story of something that happened to me many years ago. My job at the time was at a kitchen and bathroom manufacturing and supply business. We mostly supplied bespoke units of really good quality to, well, the rich, basically. People that wanted the best and could afford it, I suppose. I had no contact with customers normally as I worked in manufacturing. However, one day, a valued customer had called to say that there were some parts missing from their delivery that one of the company vans had delivered earlier that day. Sure enough, they found that the very items had fallen behind a pallet of boxes. The customer must have been insistent that they got them as soon as possible, but all of the van drivers had gone home for the night. I was only there a little after time, as I had to finish an order that was going out early the next morning. Anyway, to cut a long story short, my manager asked me if I could take one of the company vans and deliver them. The payoff was that I could have the following morning off and also get paid double time. Also, I could take the van home with me, which shortened my time. My wife was unhappy with me, should we say, but when I explained I would have the next morning off, she sort of agreed to it. After shrink-wrapping the work I'd completed, I asked the manager which van I should take, and after looking to see which one was nearest the back of the car park and not blocked in, he threw me the keys, said thank you, and pointed to the van. There were only 3 small parcels that had fallen, so I didn't need to open up the back of the van. I just threw them on the front seat next to me, then set off. I had the delivery address, and it was only about 30 miles away, and I had a pretty good idea where it was. I set off happily thinking of my unexpected lie-in the next morning. My only issue was that I was pretty hungry, but I thought if I see a shop after I deliver, I can stop for something small to eat to tide me over until I got home. The delivery went smoothly, and the customer explained that they had a joiner coming the next morning at 8 a.m. That was why they were so insistent that they got the full delivery. They were grateful that I had gone out of my way to make sure the missing pieces were brought to them and gave me a £20 tip. At that time, £20 was more like 50, so I was really glad I'd taken the job. In no time, I was on my way home. Then I passed a shop and remembered my plan to grab a little something to eat. Unfortunately, there was no place to park right outside, so I drove past a couple of closed shops and a few houses to a lay-by, with the idea of parking there and walking back to the shop. I was really hungry at this point. By this time, I'm normally at home eating my dinner. So, when I got to the shop, I bought myself a pie and some chocolate, then headed back to the van. As I got to the last house before the lay-by, though, something made me look over to it. There in the front window was an old man. He was leaning on the windowsill with his head forward. I stopped walking and watched him for a minute. He wasn't moving much, but I got the impression he was either upset or possibly feeling ill. I couldn't just leave him. He may have been living alone and in need of help. So, I walked up the driveway and up to the window and gently tapped the glass so as not to scare him. I just wanted to make sure he was okay. As I did that, the old man slowly looked up at me and then immediately disappeared in front of my eyes, kind of just dissolved into thin air. My mind went haywire, and I think I was about to run, but then I heard the front door of the house open, and out walked a middle-aged lady. She said, "Can I help you?" At first I didn't know what to say, but I was on her property, so I felt I had to say something, so I decided to tell her the truth. The lady listened to me carefully, looked over towards the window, and said to me, "Don't worry, we see him too on occasion. He's our ghost." I stared at her for a second, then said, "Oh, okay," then walked out of there and to my van. It's the strangest thing I've ever encountered. I was so shaken by it, I never ate that pie.